everybody. If you're seeing our live stream, we're going to get started in just a couple minutes to give folks some time to gather. All right, it's 10:30, so I think we can go ahead and get things started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Addie Schlossel. I'm the Stream Monitoring and AIS Coordinator for the Rock River Coalition, and I'll be moderating this session. Thank you so much for being here on Day 4 of Wisconsin Water Week to learn more about the Rock River Basin. In this session, we'll be hearing from 3 speakers. We have Todd Stuntebeck from US Geological Survey, Kyle Minks, who's a watershed manager with Dane County Land and Water Resources Department, and Luke Wynn, who's the watershed engagement specialist for Clean Lakes Alliance. They'll be speaking on the topic of water quality in the Yahara Watershed. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. The session will go until 11:15, and we are hoping to have a few minutes for questions at the end. So feel free to type any questions that you have into that Q&A section. There's also a function where you can upvote any questions that you would really like to see answered. So feel free to use that as well. And I'll be monitoring that throughout the session. Just as an FYI, I can't see the chat thread. So if you have anything that you want the presenters to address, make sure to put that in the Q&A. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand things over to our presenters.
Thanks, Eddie. Can you see my presentation mode?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Todd Stuntebeck. I'm with the US Geological Survey in the Upper Midwest Water Science Center in Middleton, Wisconsin. And I'm the leadoff hitter today. So I'm going to rip right into it as soon as my slide advances. There we go. So the Madison area lakes are located within the Yahara River watershed, and we recognize that there are significant challenges that we face in terms of both water quality and water volume, and I'll touch on both of those today. They both kind of go hand in hand. Water levels in the Madison area lakes are a very controversial topic. If you've ever been in a meeting, you know that they're very important to the citizens in the Madison area. So Dane County controls those lake levels through hydraulic structures. And so USGS provides real-time measurements of the lake levels and the volume of water inflowing from tributary streams. And so that's really critical for decision making. And obviously we also recognize that the Madison area lakes suffer from rainfall and snowmelt runoff of sediment and nutrients, which in turn causes algae blooms and other undesirable effects, which degrade recreational and economic opportunities for the community. So I'm going to touch on both today with a little bit larger focus on the water quality aspects. So the map on the left shows the Yahara River watershed. The water flows from north to south. There's a little blue circle at the bottom. That is where the Yahara River watershed dumps into the Rock River. And all the different dots on there represent locations where the USGS is conducting either streamflow or water quality monitoring or both. And why am I talking today? What is my role? My role is to basically work with collaborators to collect earth science data, turn that data into information, and then bring that to bear on societal water challenges. And we do that through collaborations and partnerships with a number of different entities. So USGS doesn't just go around putting in monitoring stations where we think it's really good to do that. We work with partners to make sure that we're measuring at the proper locations and with the proper instrumentation and the proper study designs. So if you're unfamiliar with the Madison area lakes, the Lake Mendota is the largest and it's most upstream. And the Yahara River then flows downstream into Lake Monona, Lake Wabisa, and then Lake Kaganza. And so you'll notice that most of my talk will be focused on Lake Mendota area. We have the most monitoring stations there. That's the largest lake, that's the most contributing area. And of course, what comes into Lake Mendota, all that water and what's contained in that water can move downstream and affect the downstream lakes. Very briefly, we go out and measure stream flow periodically. This is one of our hydrotechs, and he's going to go and move this instrument across the stream several times, and then through the magic of hydroacoustics and the Doppler principle and high-level math that I don't understand, he'll get an answer and find out how much stream flow is occurring at that given time. And then he'll relate that to the velocity or water level to create what we call a rating, and that allows us to have a continuous stream flow record for all of our sites for the entire year. And that photo shows an example of one of our monitoring stations. We have a bunch of different equipment in there, but what I want to point out is that silver rectangle, kind of in the lower center of the screen, that is our automated water quality sampler. So we have a data logger in there, and that works with an instrument to measure the water levels in the stream. And when we have runoff, overland runoff from rainfall runoff or snowmelt runoff, that data logger tells the sampler to take samples. And that's what's shown in the graph in the upper right. The red squares on there are when samples were collected. So after an event, we go out there, we collect the samples, we bring them back to our lab, and then we select certain samples to send to the lab for sediment and nutrient analysis, like concentrations of phosphorus or concentrations of sediment. And then at the end of each water year, we combine our stream flow data with our water quality data, and we generate loads. So daily loads of phosphorus, pounds of phosphorus, and tons of sediment. And then we turn that data into information that looks something like this. There's a lot going on here, so I'll just briefly explain it. The blue line on there represents the sum of the discharges, the daily discharges coming in from the 4 primary tributaries to Lake Mendota. That's Dorn Creek, 6 Mile Creek, Pheasant Branch, and the Yahara River at Windsor. And you can see there's different spikes on there, the largest of which occurred right after the start of the water year, which started on October 1st of 2019. The second piece of information that's critical on here is the green line, and that's the cumulative phosphorus load. And that's represented on the secondary y-axis, which goes all the way up to 80,000 here. So we start at day 1 on October 1st with 0 pounds of phosphorus, and we add in each day. And at the end of the water year, we have a sum. And in 2020, we had roughly 70,000 pounds of phosphorus entering Lake Mendota from the primary tributaries. And I'll put that 70,000 pounds in context for you in just a little bit here. But first of all, why is it important to understand what is coming into the lakes from the tributaries? Well, everybody cares about the lakes. We know that there's recreational and economic impacts. And we know that phosphorus is a big driver of the water quality that we see in the lakes. So this plot here shows the phosphorus concentrations measured within Lake Mendota over time. And your eyes are probably immediately drawn to the high points. For example, 1993, that's when we had flooding up and down the Mississippi River Valley and levees were breached. We had 2 really high peaks in 2008 and 2009. And if you live on the lakes, you were probably affected by the high water that we had those years. And then 2019 was another peak as well. So whenever we see a peak in the lake phosphorus concentration, that is often correlated to when we had a peak or a high level of inflow coming from our tributaries. There's also low numbers on here. For example, 1988, when we had a drought, 2003, dry year, 2012, dry year. So this chart demonstrates 2 different things. Number one, that phosphorus concentrations in the lake are in part dependent upon what comes off of our landscapes. And 2, that the lake may respond relatively quickly to actions that we take on our landscapes to significantly reduce phosphorus runoff. So I've been focusing on the tributaries, the phosphorus delivered from the tributaries, and there's a good reason for that. This pie chart shows the total estimated concentration, loads coming into the lake from all external sources. So 6 Mile Creek, Yahara River, Pheasant Branch, and Dorn, by and large, make up the majority of what's coming into the lake. But we also need to recognize that there's urban contributions, there's direct deposition, and other unmeasured areas that are making their presence felt on the lake. And if we focus in though on the tributaries again, and we look at the timing of when phosphorus enters the lake, by and large, that happens in January through March. So this is the frozen ground snowmelt period. In any given year, it's widely variable, but the long-term average shows that roughly half of our phosphorus gets into the lake in this January through March snowmelt period. And that's typically followed up by the April through June period, and then generally lesser amounts in the July through December period. And so what this demonstrates is that, number one, focusing our efforts to reduce phosphorus from the tributaries is important. But when we go into the watersheds of these tributaries, focusing our efforts to reduce phosphorus runoff during the winter and spring periods has the most potential to make substantive changes to the overall phosphorus loading to Lake Mendota. So now we'll get into the Wayback Machine just a little bit here. I had already talked about 2020 tributary loads to Lake Mendota. This is what happened in 2019. So if we look again at our secondary y-axis here, notice that it goes up to 160,000 rather than the 80,000 of the previous chart. We had almost 150,000 pounds of phosphorus enter Lake Mendota in 2019. So it's almost double what happened in 2020. And the big reason for that is that our frozen ground, our snowmelt period from January through March or so, had 3 very significant runoff periods in which in total about 100,000 pounds of phosphorus was delivered to the lake. So just in that wintertime only, we had 100,000 pounds delivered in 2019, which was more than we measured all of 2020. So again, remember, this is the tributary contributions only, and there are other urban sources as well. So the wintertime period is important. Well, let's put our loads from 2020 and 2019 into a longer term perspective here. We have about 150,000 pounds in 2019. We have our approximately 70,000 pounds in 2020. And you can look back over time, and each dot represents the tributary loading to Lake Mendota. And that red dotted line represents our long-term average, which is about 65,000 pounds. And you can see that there's high numbers up here. There's 1993 that stands out, 2008 and 2009 that stand out, but there are also a lot of lower dots here in the 20 to 40,000 pound range. And in general, those are time periods in which we had better water quality. And so what we're trying to do overall is lower that dotted line from 65,000 pounds down to the 30,000 pound range or so. Now, if we want to look at long-term, lots of people recognize that we have a problem with water quality in the lake. This goes back decades and decades and decades. And obviously a lot has been done over the past 30 years, which is shown in this plot here, to address phosphorus loss from our landscapes. But if you look at those dots there, you can't see a downward trend. We're really just kind of staying level or maybe even increasing a little bit. But that's not from lack of effort. And although we've made a lot of progress on the landscape, it just has not been fully realized in the lakes. And so other people have coined the term, that's just other practices are keeping us on the treadmill, or we're holding serve, or we're treading water. And the reason is that we don't live in a static environment. Things are shifting and changing all the time. And I point out a paper here that came out in 2015 called Shifting Drivers, and it discusses how precipitation characteristics are changing, becoming more intense. Urbanization obviously is extending into the agricultural areas, and then we have agriculture that's changing as well. And then if you're a lake person, you're interested in what's happening in the lake. From a biotic standpoint, the communities out there in Lake Mendota are changing as well, because we have had the introduction of spiny water flea and zebra mussels. And all of this means that if we really want to make a system work the way we want it to work, we need to adaptively manage it. We need to try something. We need to measure what's happening. We need to determine whether or not what we've done has had the desired effect. And if it doesn't, then we're going to have to go back and modify our strategies as we see appropriate. So there's widespread understanding that despite great effort, our phosphorus loads aren't decreasing as we would expect. But it doesn't mean that we're giving up as a community. And the next two talks actually are going to highlight some of the continued efforts that are being undertaken to better control phosphorus runoff from our landscapes. And that's what I have. Kyle.
Thanks, Todd. I'll just share my screen quick. Sorry, one second. All right, is everyone able to see my screen?
It's good.
That's good.
All right, thanks, Todd. All right, as Todd alluded to, kind of this adaptive principle that's out there to change and finding and understanding kind of the environment and the impacts it has on water quality is something we at the county have been working on, and we're going to present to you a little bit today on one of our projects called Suck the Muck, or the removal of in-stream legacy sediment from Dorn Creek. And so just to give a little background of the study location, we are on the northern side of Lake Mendota. It's a small watershed called Dorn Creek. That creek has two USGS stream monitoring gauges located on it that Todd highlighted before, one on County Highway Q and the other one located on County Highway M. The watershed is approximately 8,000 acres in size, and 6,000 of those acres is cropland. And this watershed has been of particular focus for the county in working with agricultural producers to implement what we call best management practices. And the purpose of that is those practices help reduce phosphorus, in which case that means less phosphorus getting into nearby surface waters. So one of the assessments that we did in that watershed back in 2014 was to look at two primary kind of indicators or indexes. Those include soil loss. So how much soil loss do we see using one of our tools called Snap Plus within the watershed? And the other one is the phosphorus index, or roughly how much phosphorus is coming off some of those agricultural fields within the watershed. The targets that we kind of shoot for soil loss based on the soil types in this watershed was around 4 tons per acre. And what we were seeing was that roughly on an average from the lands that we had available, around 1.8 tons per acre per year was being lost from those agricultural fields. So just highlighting here, well below the target of where we're trying to be at within ag fields in the watershed. When we look at the phosphorus index, we've got a target of 6. And what we found in looking at the fields there is that the average phosphorus index was around 3. So once again, well below the target of 6, about half of that, which indicates a lot of good land management practices going in to prevent soil and phosphorus from getting to nearby surface waters. However, as we dove into some of the water quality data that USGS was starting to collect from the monitoring stations they have located here, the amount of phosphorus in the system was interesting to say the least. And so here is just a graph showing a typical water year from October to September for 2016. And one of the things that we noticed, each bar here, the blue represents the dissolved forms of phosphorus and the green is the particulate. And so each bar represents basically the total phosphorus loading at the Highway M gauge, which is the furthest downstream gauge. What was interesting is that we saw a large amount of dissolved phosphorus in the system. So the majority, actually about 61% of the total load in the 2016 water year was in this dissolved form. That equates to roughly 2,300 pounds in particulate and over 3,000 pounds in dissolved. What's interesting about that is that most of our upland water quality practices are really targeted at this particulate fraction. And there's less practices that we do out there that really focus in on dissolved forms. So it made us kind of question what's kind of going on within the stream. Another metric that we kind of look at is called the water quality phosphorin criteria, which is for the state. It's a statewide rule that's out there and sets targets of the concentration of phosphorus we're trying to shoot or hit. And for this particular stream, our target concentration is 0.075 milligrams per liter. And when we look in 2016, we were at about 0.24, so well above that target concentration that we were shooting for. And so we started to investigate and dig in a little bit more to see what was going on in the streams. And this video is going to highlight a little bit about what we found. This individual here is Mike Sorge from the Department of Natural Resources, one of our partners on the projects. And so I'll just play the video here. This is what we found in our investigation, is the stream, particularly Dorn Creek, was chock full of these areas with large amounts of sediment buildup and accumulation. And so one of the big questions we had is are these sediments that he's trying to get out of right now having an impact on water quality? Are they impacting the amount of phosphorus we're seeing at the stream gauges? And that's going to end here shortly. And so with that, we set up kind of a study to investigate this. And the study consisted of kind of three major analyses. We wanted to see how much phosphorus was in the sediment. So that's kind of on the right side here. You see a sediment core that was put into the sediment, and then we stratified that core into different layers and sampled the total amount or concentration of phosphorus in that sediment. We also collected surface water samples to see how much dissolved phosphorus was in the water itself. And then we also set up what's called a P-diffusion process, in which we took the sediment cores themselves, took water from the stream, put them in a lab and controlled environment, and then tried to determine whether or not the phosphorus in the water was being absorbed by the sediments or whether the sediments were releasing phosphorus into the water. And that's kind of our P-diffusion experiment. And so here on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the results that we found. The first one was that the phosphorus concentration in the sediments alone on average were around 5,000 milligrams per kilogram, or 5,000 parts per million. To put that in context, an adjacent crop field had a concentration of around 700 milligrams per kilogram. And we also went and sampled a barnyard, which was in heavy use by livestock, and that concentration was around 10,000 milligrams per kilogram. So not as high as an individual feedlot or barnyard, but certainly much higher than adjacent cropland. When we looked at the phosphorus diffusion, just what was coming out or going into sediments, we found that the sediments were actually releasing phosphorus into the water column at a rate of about 0.075 milligrams per liter. And if you remember back to the previous slide on the water quality data that I showed, this is that target concentration that we were shooting for. So if we were in essence able to shut everything off in the system and only look at what's coming out of the sediments into the overlying water column, we'd be at that target concentration. And then another test that we looked at was to see what's the approximate age of these sediments. Are they relatively new? Did they recently come into the stream, or are these relatively old sediments that have been deposited years ago? And so we did some isotope dating, and what this graph is showing here is that if you go roughly a foot down in sediment, the age was around 25 years old. If you go 2 feet down, we see that it was a little less than 75 years old, or roughly around 75 years old. And then we had a sample that was all the way down to about 2.5 feet, and that was as old as 125 years old. So when you get down to the bottom sediments, they're relatively old sediments. They're not from recent runoff events that we've had within the watershed. So once we kind of identified that there was a significant amount of phosphorus in the sediments, we wanted to see if there's a way that we could remove them. And so we put together a pilot test in which we bowered a hydraulic dredge from the DNR actually, and tried to remove the sediments through hoses and pipes to a dewatering basin that you see over here on the left-hand side to see if we could do this safely without causing more damage to the environment. And it was great to do that here because we had USGS stream monitoring the whole time we were pilot testing removal. That removal was really successful. We showed that we could remove some sediments without causing a lot of harm. And so with that, we decided to see if we could scale this up, and we put together a project in which we wanted to try to remove 2.7 miles worth of stream reach within Dorn Creek. And so that project kicked off in 2018 as part of a 2017 budget initiative at the county. And there was really 4 major goals of that project. The first one being a rehabilitation of water quality, the restoration of stream habitat, the realignment of the stream channel, and a reclamation of a formal gravel pit that we used for the dewatering area. And so the next couple slides that I have here are just going to show a little bit post-removal, what we've seen in water quality. So that project finished up in 2018. And since then, in 2019 and 20, we've been continuing to collect water quality samples. And what we found pretty much is that there was no noticeable change in the total annual phosphorus loading. As Todd kind of alluded to, that is primarily being driven by storm events and runoff and precipitation. And instead of less of kind of the in-stream sediment movement. And then, but we did see a noticeable reduction in the base flow phosphorus concentration. So that's what the next slides will show. So here is just a slide that's showing all of the base flow water quality samples that were collected. And this is a difference between the gauges at highway M and Q. Basically, we wanted to focus in just on the treatment area. So that's what the difference graph is intended to show. Each blue dot represents a base flow sample that was collected in the corresponding month. And the red line is just a rolling average trend line, just to kind of draw your attention, because it's highly variable and somewhat scattered on what we've seen both before sediment removal and after. And the kind of pinkish or orangish shaded area is the period of sediment removal. So what you can see here is that post-removal, there was a pretty significant drop in the total phosphorus concentration between the two gauges. When we dive in deeper to look at the constituents of the total phosphorus, again, that dissolved fraction and the particulate fraction, we see even a more significant drop in the dissolved portion of the phosphorus, but we also are seeing it a little bit here in the particulate fraction as well. Which was good. It was nice to see that there was a positive impact, at least in reducing base flow phosphorus concentrations. The last slide that I have here is to just focus in a little bit more on that water quality criterion that we have through the state of Wisconsin. That target concentration of 0.075 is represented here in the green line. This is showing the median concentration for each of the different years. The blue dots are represented at highway M, and the orange dots are at highway Q. And so prior to the sediment removal, you can see we had pretty high median concentrations at highway M. Post removal, we start to see that highway M concentration drop down near to, and if not even in 2020, below what we saw at that upstream highway Q gauge. And so again, this is just kind of re-emphasizing the fact that we're seeing that reduction in the base flow phosphorus concentration. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke here to take off and talk a little bit more about the Yahara Winds, or sorry, the CLA initiative in Yahara Clean.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you to both Todd and Kyle for providing some excellent context to what I'm going to talk about this morning. Maybe take a step back from some of the data and kind of talk about our community's vision for cleaner lakes and maybe how we can get there. So I'm going to start off with a vision statement, classic move. Clean Lakes Alliance envisions a future in which everyone realizes that the lakes are the center of the community. And we want to achieve that vision by building partnerships and bringing groups together. So businesses, nonprofits, friends groups, government agencies, volunteers, bringing them together to try to achieve that vision. And what I like to point out about this vision is what's not in this vision. You don't see phosphorus mentioned. You don't see invasive species or PFAS. We're not talking about specifics. We don't even mention clean lakes in that vision. So we really have this philosophy that if we can get more and more people to recognize the lakes in our watershed as the valuable asset that they are, those other things are going to fall into place. Really simple, right? So how do we make the lakes a top priority in the community? Well, we set that vision, and then we really recruit influencers. We really recruit people that are lake advocates. That's businesses and organizations, government agencies like represented by Todd and Kyle that talked just now, and bring everyone together to work on this problem. And we empower action through a couple of different ways. We fundraise for projects. Obviously, funding initiatives is incredibly important. Mobilizing volunteers to do hands-on restoration work, restoring prairies, protecting that landscape that connects to our lakes. And one of the big things we do is we educate and advocate on behalf of the lakes. And so we do that in a couple of different ways. We have volunteerism. We engage in volunteers, like I said, to maintain and protect those green spaces, maintain our shorelines, just making them more accessible. We have a monthly presentation series called Clean Lakes 101. I believe Todd and Kyle have probably presented at those at some point in the long history of our presentation series. We had a great one yesterday morning, actually, where we heard from some amazing Dane County staff on their progress towards water quality improvements and fighting back against climate change. We have youth education through our Lake Explorer Camp, right? Instilling that lake advocacy at a young age is incredibly valuable in creating new generations of lake advocates. And we try to engage the community so that they can begin to understand some of the problems we're facing. And it's not just the scientists looking into this. We need everyone to be involved. And I really like to point out our citizen monitoring program, our volunteer lake water quality monitoring program. This is an amazing program with some amazing volunteers. We have over 85 volunteers across all 5 lakes, including Lake Wingra, that are collecting water quality samples multiple times a week throughout the entire summer. So they're going out to these sites, they're monitoring sites and measuring water clarity with transparency tubes. They've been trained to identify harmful algal blooms like cyanobacteria. And then that information gets reported and uploaded to a database that's accessible by anybody, so that people that are wanting to recreate in the lakes can make a more informed decision, look at maybe areas to avoid if there's a cyanobacteria bloom that could be a risk to maybe their children or their pets. And that information also provides an incredible monitoring tool. Todd talked a lot about Streamflow monitoring. There's kind of a lack of information in the nearshore environment, in the lake right next to the shore where people are accessing the water. And this creates a really robust data set to look and compare how water quality varies over time. We host a number of events. Part of that vision is going to be accomplished by bringing people to the water. We really believe that if you can increase that accessibility to the water, generate excitement around the water, you can kind of inspire that advocacy. And so we host things like our Frozen Assets Festival. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that this year, but our lakes are our biggest parks, and especially in the winter, they become our biggest parks. And getting people out onto the ice and experience the lake maybe in a new way that they're not familiar with. Our Loop the Lake bike ride, our Big Swell swim, right? Getting people engaged with the water is an incredibly important part of this. And so behind all that advocacy, we are tracking our progress. Todd talked about the stream monitoring, and Kyle talked about some of the specific actions that are going on. But Clean Lakes Alliance works with all of these partners to create a State of the Lakes report. And this is all part of the Yahara Clean, which is an initiative that was started many years ago that established a phosphorus reduction goal for our community, for our lakes. That's about 46,000 pounds annually diverted from entering our lakes can achieve water quality that we want. And that number is generated kind of looking at what drought years look like for our lakes and what kind of water quality we're seeing during those drought years. And we're tracking that progress. And we work with all of our watershed partners to kind of canvas and collect this information, work with farmers, work with Kyle. Kyle's a big piece of this to track down this data and kind of generate our report for our community's progress and our lake's progress. And as Todd mentioned, the treadmill, we're realizing that despite all this amazing effort and these increased efforts, we're not seeing the water quality results that we want as a community. And Todd mentioned that that's primarily a result of that increased precipitation as a result of climate change. We're seeing more higher volume, more intense rainfall, and more frequent rainfall. And that's moving that goalpost away from us. And so that's where the Yahara Clean Compact comes into play. And for those of you that this is a new thing, I truly can't dedicate the necessary time to talking about how monumental an effort this is. And there's a long history to this effort as well. I really encourage you actually to look at our website, and you can actually look at some of the history of the Yahara Clean Compact and what we're trying to do right now. But we've essentially brought together 19 collaborators and organizations that are dedicated to achieving the water quality results we want in our lakes, and working together to update that roadmap to clean water because we recognize we're going to have to ramp up our efforts. And one of the outcomes of this Yahara Clean Compact is going to be recommendations on what we can do as a community. And we want to look at those specific actions that were identified many years ago in the original iteration of the Clean Compact. What are those actions that we can to dial up? What's working, what's not working, what are some new actions like suck the muck that we weren't really aware of back when this roadmap was originally created? So how can we adapt to these new challenges, and how can we really refocus our priorities? And another piece of this is going to be a really dedicated public engagement and outreach portion that you'll be hearing more about. But it's like I said, it's not just the lake managers, it's volunteers, it's the community, it's everyone that relies on these lakes as a community asset. And so to kind of wrap things up, we want to be able to use our lakes. It's pretty simple. I want to be able to go swim in the lakes. I want to be able to take my 2 dogs and not fear for their health if they're being exposed to cyanobacteria. And we want our beaches to be open. If you look at this graph, you can see that our median is close to 100 closure days across all of our public beaches here in the Yahara Watershed. And we need to reverse that trend. We want our lakes to be more accessible. And I think there's a lot of amazing work that's going into making that happen. And finally, to wrap up, Sissy, make sure we have some time for questions. This is an incredibly complex problem. We as a society and community have drastically altered our landscape. We've altered our wetlands and our streams and our rivers, and we have to work together to create a more resilient future for our lakes. And I think there's a lot of amazing organizations that are working towards that, farmers, government agencies, but it's going to take everybody to achieve that goal of cleaner lakes. And with that, that's my brief presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that I'm sure Todd and Kyle would as well.
Thanks, Luke and Kyle and Todd, for those great presentations. I am not seeing any questions in the thread right now, so if you have any for any of our presenters, feel free to go ahead and post them. As we wait for any potential questions to come in, Luke, if folks want to get involved in the Clean Lakes Alliance, how could they do that? Yeah,
absolutely. Shoot me an email at luke.wynn@cleanlakesalliance.org, and I can get you on our volunteer list. If you're interested in water quality monitoring, that's a great way to engage and help with the lakes. And I just, encourage you to reach out and connect with us, and we can put you in the right direction.
That's really cool. Yeah, I'm also very new to the area. So where can folks find that data that folks are collecting at the lakes? Check in on the water
absolutely.
quality.
You can, so if you go to lakeforecast.org, or it's actually an Android and iOS app as well. You can download it on your phone, and we're the lakes are starting to melt right now, and I just reached out to our volunteers, so we're going to start gearing up for the season. But you can use that app to kind of look throughout the summer and see what people are reporting. And then our website also has kind of the historical data as well. Has some reports from what our volunteers have been able to collect.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. No questions coming in yet. Kyle, I'm just gonna throw questions at you guys as we wait. I was curious about the reclamation of the gravel pit that you were able to wrap into the Suck the Muck initiative. Could you talk a little bit about how that worked?
Sure. Yeah. So within the project area that we had, the stream that was flowing through there, there was a prior gravel pit that had been kind of grown up with invasive species and trees, and so as part of the project, we needed to identify a dewatering area, and so we thought, well, that presented itself a good opportunity to use that old gravel pit for the dewatering area, and then to seed that over into a more kind of prairie permanent vegetation, and just kind of that more to a natural environment instead of letting the invasives take over.
Sure. Yeah, that's awesome that you were able to kind of combine those two needs.
Yeah, and being an old gravel pit, there was all sorts of unique things that we found as we were at site for the dewatering basins, cars and tires and a lot of other things. It had a lot of other good environmental benefits other than just dewatering.
Yeah, that's really neat. Very cool. Yeah. And Todd, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, I saw that in your discussion of how we're sort of treading water, you had mentioned like the invasive species like zebra mussel and spiny water flea as contributing to phosphorus. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I might not have been very clear on that. It's the changes in the biotic communities aren't contributing phosphorus to the lake, but what they're doing is they're using phosphorus differently, and the effects that are being seen in the lake are changing. For example, the spiny water flea, it affects the food chain and how algae are processed, and so it changes how clear the water is, how phosphorus is moved through the biotic communities. Zebra mussels also have a tendency to shunt or move phosphorus to the lake edges, and so what we're seeing is more different types of algal growth on the edges of the lake. Yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting into with the biotic changes that are going on out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Definitely a lot of factors.
Mm-hmm.
It's changing all the time. All right. Well, I'm still not seeing any questions, so I think maybe we can go ahead and wrap this up. But yeah, thank you guys so much for speaking with us today. This was a really great presentation. To give folks an idea of what's coming up next, we'll have a 15-minute break, or I guess maybe closer to 20 if we're wrapping up a couple minutes early. So you can feel free to, go get a snack. There's a bathroom. You can also visit the exhibitor and sponsor booths. I think there's a photo contest maybe still going on. Check all that stuff out. And then we'll be coming back at 11:30 with an update on the Rock River Basin's TMDL. So I hope to see you guys there. Yeah, and thank you again to Todd, Luke, and Kyle for the presentation.
Thank you, Addie. Well done.
Yes. Thanks, Addie.
Thanks, Addie.